Marker. And action.
This is Behind the Bells, the show that takes you behind the magic of your favorite Christmas movies and shows. Within the background of every Santa Claus, reindeer, and stocking is a story. Where did it come from? Our Christmas movie expert will unravel all of that and give you the full story. Sit back and enjoy another episode with Robert Nicholas.
Merry Monday, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Bells. I'm your host, Robert Nicholas, and I'll be taking you on another one-horse open sleigh ride into the world of Christmas movies. Here's a brief recap of what was covered in the last episode. John Hughes was riding high after the success of various 1980s projects like 16 Candles, Weird Science, The Breakfast Club, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Each of these movies proved that he understood how the youth thought. Other projects like Mr. Mom, National Lampoon's Vacation, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles showcased his abilities to write adults as vulnerable as kids were. John Hughes was packing for an upcoming vacation when he got the idea for Home Alone, when he thought of what would happen if he forgot his 10-year-old. His first draft included elements like burglars, the home traps, and Old Man Marley. At the same time he was writing it, he was also working on Uncle Buck. The first draft of Home Alone was completed in 10 days, and John was concerned he was working too slowly. Once he finished the script, he sent it to Chris Columbus, who was still recovering after the box office bomb of Heartbreak Hotel. Chris was originally hired to direct National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, but quit the sequel due to the attitude of Chevy Chase. Chris agreed to take on Home Alone because he connected with the emotional context of coming of age and also liked the holiday theme due to his passion for Christmas. Chris added in more dialogue, but mostly contributed to expanding the story of Old Man Marley and giving his arc a more direct closure. Home Alone was then set up at Warner Brothers with a $10 million budget and a demand to cast known stars as the adult characters. John and Chris requested and got permission to do the entire production in the Chicago area to keep the production authentic and to get away from studio meddling. Though a casting call for Kevin was done, John Hughes had his heart set out on Macaulay Culkin after working with him on Uncle Buck. Though several hundred boys auditioned, Chris Columbus felt Mac had an imperfect look that several children could relate to. For Harry, they first approached John Lovitz and Robert De Niro, but both declined. Joe Pesci took the role as he always wanted to work with children. Daniel Stern was written in mind for Marv, as both John and Chris were fans of his acting in Breaking Away, which I mentioned too was an underrated film that people need to see. The rest of the adults casted, including Kevin's parents, family, and various parts, were filled with either comedians that Chris really liked or were at least local to the Chicago area. So, what was it like for Macaulay Culkin to lead a movie? What kind of work went into giving the movie such a warm glow, giving it a Christmas feel? How did Joe Pesci prevent himself from cursing up a storm? How did the movie get made when it got shut down? And of course, why did the movie stay at number 1 at the box office well after the holidays? Well, let's take our steps carefully and watch out for traps. This is part 2 of the Home Alone story. Toward the end of 1989, Chris Columbus, John Hughes, and the rest of the production crew arrived in Winnetka, Illinois to start setting up shop with the goal of beginning in the new year. The same town had also been used for various past films by John Hughes, like The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and most recently, Uncle Buck. At that point, John could have walked through the entire town blindfolded. Because there were few to none sound stages, certainly the size you'd expect out of Universal Studios, they ended up using the gym at the New Trier High School, where the building had been abandoned when the campus was being downsized due to decreased student attendance. The advantage of the gym was that it already had a grid-like ceiling that would be easy to set up lighting in. The space would also be large enough to build the interior of the home, and I mean the entire home, with a second floor and usable stairs. On top of that, other unused classrooms would be used to house the production offices and facilities for the rest of the crew. Speaking of the home, the location scouting team was given the task of finding a house to be used in the story. They already knew that because of the large size of the crew, it would be unlikely that any interiors were going to be used and would ultimately not be used. They spent about 10 hours each day scouting various upper middle class mansions in the North Shore region of Winnetka. According to the head production designer, they needed a home that would be timeless, warm, and inviting. It would also need to look like a home that could become a giant tool when it came time for Kevin to set up his traps. To quote Chris Columbus, John had written very specific physical humor for the end of the film, and it was extremely important that the house fits the gags of the movie, particularly from a visual point of view and from a stunts point of view. We needed a house that could work with Kevin when he fools the burglars into thinking he's not home alone and he attaches a cutout of Michael Jordan to a toy train. The house needed to work in that respect in terms of the shadows. Also, in terms of when the treehouse was located behind the house and how Harry and Marv would be fooled into climbing across the rope and then swinging into the house. The back of the house needed to work for that. So we needed to cast a house that could work with the stunts and also a house that was visually appealing and, if this makes sense, warm and menacing at the same time. It's the kind of house that if you were a kid, it would be fun to be left home alone. End quote. The home would be found at 671 Lincoln Avenue, though the address in the movie would end up being 656 Lincoln Boulevard. As planning was almost finished, they encountered two major problems. They saw that with more time needed to get the necessary shots, the overall shoot would need to be extended from 6 to 8 weeks. This wasn't an issue for the crew or the main cast, all except for Daniel Stern. Daniel was going through a good time in his career thanks to his role as the narrator on The Wonder Years. So with his ego turned up a little more, he asked to be compensated for the necessary 2 extra weeks. John refused, stating that the production cost wouldn't allow it. Stern was then fired, and they immediately cast Daniel Roebuck, fresh off of his TV show Matlock. They flew him up to Illinois to shoot some screen tests with Joe Pesci, but it turns out there was going to be another issue. The second major problem starting to arise was the cost of the budget. John had originally hoped that with the location being mostly inside a home, it would be able to accommodate the $10 million budget. But what no one expected was how much money was going into the design of the home. I'm not talking about the style and the furniture, but interestingly enough, the Christmas decorations. Chris Columbus was insistent on crafting a story in which every shot would either have decorations or the use of the colors red, green, or white. This would result in the kind of Christmas home that almost resembled something out of a Pottery Barn or a Ralph Lauren catalog. It would turn out looking like a magical Christmas dreamland. But, unlike the dreamland where no expense is spared, expense played a factor in the real world. John would eventually submit the final budget to Warner Brothers, in which it would be more like $14 million. The executives were not happy about that. $14 million would also be the budget cost of the upcoming Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. But that one at least had the popularity of the cartoon. Home Alone was an original story. The Turtles had the Foot Clan and the Shredder to fight. Kevin had Harry and Marv. The Turtles had elaborate suits designed by Jim Henson. Home Alone's design was all about how pretty it can make the house look. Warner's then asked if they can get the budget down to $13.5 million as a compromise, but everyone knew that they couldn't scale back any further. It seemed like that the movie would stop there. Warner's phoned John and Chris to let them know that Home Alone was officially shut down. No more movie. The production manager even went to the set, going to every office to let the crew know they had to pack up and go. Chris thought that this would be the absolute end of his filmmaking career. What he nor anyone else knew about was that John had made a backhand, perhaps not entirely legal deal with 20th Century Fox. John had sensed that Warner's was not going to approve of the larger budget. As his crew was going back and forth with the bean counters, he had spoken with a friend named Tom Jacobson. This guy also happened to be an executive vice president and had a direct link with Joe Roth, who was then the studio head of 20th Century Fox. They all had lunch where John talked about the story of Home Alone and vented his frustrations with Warner's. When Tom was told of the required budget, he replied, "Well, I'll make that movie at that price in a second." They got a copy of the script and were shown test footage, which again was probably not legal. But the folks at Fox liked what they saw and signed a new contract ensuring that the production of Home Alone was still on, just under a different studio. In fact, well, a fun fact, with the Warner's production manager going around to the whole crew telling them it's over, an executive producer was following close behind, telling the same crew people, "It's not over, it's now a Fox movie, don't worry about it." By the next day, everyone was wearing Fox shirts designating their support for the new studio that was keeping Home Alone alive. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back shortly to talk about the shooting and eventual release of Home Alone.
And now back to the show with our Christmas movie expert, Robert Nicholas.
With the real Christmas season giving the cast and crew a break, they all returned to Chicago to begin shooting on February 13th, 1990. The first scene filmed was the movie within a movie, Angels with Filthy Souls. The script for the sequence came in later, with John Hughes trying his hardest to authentically replicate the crisp dialogue of a 40s gangster movie. In fact, the script had only called it a gangster movie with its title, Angels with Filthy Souls, which itself was a reference to a real James Cagney movie, Angels with Dirty Faces, not even becoming official until they shot the scene of Kevin watching the movie. According to art director Dan Webster, they believe that the title was only decided upon right at the moment where they needed to create a label for the tape that Kevin puts into the VHS player, and decided that the title itself was a very old-fashioned sentence. With only a few walls used as the set, black and white negative film, authentic lighting that made the set very hot, and fake mist generated, the Angels with Filthy Souls part was shot in one day with Ralph Foodie and Michael Guido playing the gangsters. They all started shooting the real movie the next day with the scene at the pharmacy where Kevin attempts to find a new toothbrush. The location was a real pharmacy, though they only used the exterior. The interiors were recreated in a nearby store called the Grand Food Center. The pharmacy would eventually close to become a Panera Bread, and as of 2021 is now an ice cream shop called Grater's. The park across the store, Hubbard Woods Park, was used to film the chase between Kevin and the cop, but the stay also proved to be a problem for something filmmakers had no control over: weather. Though winter was in play at the time, the snowfall had been unusually light for 1990. The warm weather had already melted the majority of whatever was dropped earlier. This meant that a lot of faux snow had to be generated, which included ice that was crushed in the snow and coils of glycol, which is what Kevin was sliding on when he was making his escape from the cop. A lot of the exterior scenes were able to work around the fact that its snow was fake, but they knew that for the last scene of the movie, Christmas morning when the family returned, they all needed a lot more of the real thing. Chris Columbus needed a white Christmas with snowfall. Around the third week of shooting, they got an early Christmas miracle. They were initially planned to shoot more interiors back at the gym when the crew got notices that snow was happening that day. They dropped all plans and everything was now set on getting what was called the money shot. What you saw on film was a real blizzard that was falling. It made the house even more beautiful, but it wasn't enough for Chris. He needed the snow to continue blowing. Today, it's easy to simulate a snowfall with computer effects. I myself could go into my After Effects program and make it look like a snowfall is happening right here in my office. But in 1990, they had to use more practical means. In order to get the snow to look like it was continuously falling, they used potato flakes. It's hard to tell that watching the film again. Potatoes were and still are used because the flakes do have a similar lightweight look to authentic snow. The only downside was that with the warm weather coming back, it was starting to melt just as fast as it came in. But with the real snow mixing in with potato flakes, it aged them and degraded them, giving the surrounding a very funky old vegetable smell. Everyone was happy to know they only had to do this once. Back at the gym, filming went a lot smoother since they didn't have to control any weather. They just had to control their actors. I mentioned before that shooting with child actors can be difficult for a lot of reasons. Some of it is behavior-based, but the majority of the issue were the labor laws in place. They were limited to how many hours they could work with Macaulay, and they were not allowed to shoot any later than 10 p.m. The good news was that behavior was not going to be an issue at all. The production commended Macaulay for how professional he was when it came to working. That's not to say he didn't act like a kid. There's plenty of behind-the-scenes material that shows him having the time of his life, talking to Chris Columbus or annoying other cast members. When he had to get serious, he was right on point, able to memorize lines without any kind of trouble, and would even contribute a few elements that made the script better. In fact, I should talk about this famous element.
I can't seem to find my toothbrush, so I'll pick one up when I go out today. Other than that, I'm in good shape.
A fun side note, the script had only called Kevin to slap his cheeks, put his hands down, and scream to the feeling of aftershave absorbing to his face. It was Macaulay's idea to keep his hands on his face as he made the scream, reasoning that most kids tend to apply pressure to any area that hurts. This image would end up on the marketing and movie posters, not to mention all the comparisons to the Edvard Munch oil painting, The Scream. End side note. In order to properly capture the world from his point of view, Chris and the director of photography, William McCat, planned to shoot the majority of the movie from Kevin's perspective at a low angle. He wanted the house, no matter how small it may appear to an adult, to appear bigger to Kevin. To quote him, "I used to spend a lot of time on my knees just to see everything from that angle." It should come as no surprise that he was inspired by A Christmas Story, which was also shot with a similar philosophy. It's a good thing that Kevin is such a relatable character that we want to follow his viewpoint. Macaulay would end up having the charisma and energy to keep everything going. The burglars, on the other hand, were about to correct a previous mistake. Daniel Roebuck shot more screen footage with Joe Pesci, but it was clear that there was not much chemistry. Their back and forth dialogue was not natural, and you never got the sense that they worked together for years. Daniel Stern had that. Now that Home Alone had a larger budget, Chris Columbus went back to him, finally agreeing to pay him the extra money he requested for the overtime. Daniel was on the next plane to Chicago. To this day, Daniel has called his decision to initially leave pig-headed, and even called himself an idiot for almost letting a good opportunity slip through him. Even with Daniel back on board, the crew couldn't believe that Macaulay Culkin, a 10-year-old, was more behaved than Joe Pesci. Unlike the rest of the cast and crew that were more used to doing comedies or family films, Joe was much more experienced in dramatic roles and saw himself as a thespian. It wasn't that he didn't like the movie he was making, but he felt that a lot of the things he was saying or doing were similar to low-hanging fruit. A lot of that stemmed from the fact that the script had none of his traditional swearing that a Scorsese movie might have. It may have seemed like a diva thing to complain about, but those in the industry are well aware that Joe Pesci had one of the filthiest mouths in Hollywood. In fact, he even once said that in order to read his scripts, he'll find any excuse to put in a swear in any sentence. So rather than saying, "Hello, how are you doing?" he'll say, "Hello, you rat. How the hell are you, you mother you?" Rumor has it that the Home Alone set had a swear jar on set, and Joe Pesci filled the whole thing up in the first week. To allow a more family-friendly Joe Pesci into Home Alone, Joe and Daniel took inspiration from Yosemite Sam from the Looney Tunes. If you listen to the cartoon's voice, you can tell that rather than letting him curse up a storm, he mutters a gibberish language that could imply anything.
Dirty Turkish back flat important
Joe liked the idea of cartoon cursing and saw it as an acceptable substitute for his sailor mouth. Most of it was restricted to the climax of the traps, but the same attitude gets through. You can tell that Joe is imagining if 15 F-bombs he's trying to drop, filtering through his imagination, and finally letting out his edited, quote-unquote, Yosemite Sam speak.
Be a good little fella now and open the door.
Shoot!
What? 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 What happened?
Get that little...
Regardless, though he would slip up every now and then, most remembered him being very sweet with the kids. The crew simply accepted that they were lucky to be able to work with this guy, and if his mouth was a part of the cost of using him, so be it. The rest of the cast shot their scenes in the middle of the production. The pizza night sequence, which according to the majority of the cast, was not as pleasant as shown on screen since the pizza had already gone cold and would take multiple days to shoot, as they consistently had to clean up when Kevin unloads on Buzz. The hardest scene in the entire movie turned out to be the Chicago O'Hare airport sequence, in which the family had to run to catch the flight. Though anyone would have to be stupid to run in an airport today, in the world of pre-September 11th, it was common for people to make it to the plane minutes before the doors were closed. According to Senta Moses, the actress who played Kevin's sister Tracy, even with the terminal closed to let them shoot, it required many days due to the complexities of the shot. To quote her, "There were thousands of extras, all expertly choreographed so none of us would be in danger of running at full speed through the American Airlines terminal. And we ran at full speed. Sometimes we'd bump into each other like a multi-car pileup on the expressway and just crack up laughing. There were so many setups and narrowly missed moments of disaster, but to my knowledge, no one got hurt." End quote. Of course, I should bring up the sequence you would have thought would have been the most difficult, the Christmas Eve night of traps. I've mentioned in the last episode that the traps were all written into the script by John Hughes. It was up to the production designers to create them, and the stuntmen to pull off the slapstick. Only one of the traps required anything complex.
A dead kid.
The blowtorch was a Pepper's Ghost effect, with a dummy being set on fire, with Joe Pesci's image superimposed with reflective glass. The rest was all movie tricks. The nail Daniel steps on was rubber. The ornaments he also stepped on were candy. The red-hot iron on the doorknob was neon tubing. Even the tarantula, though real, didn't have ears, so Daniel really did invoke a hilarious scream.
Harry, help me get up! I got him!
Standing in for Pesci and Stern were stuntmen Troy Brown and Leon Delaney, who took the bolt of the abuse, practiced their falls and slips similar to how an actor rehearses. Chris was always concerned for their safety, but credited their bravery. To quote from Chris, "Every time the stunt guys did one of those stunts, it wasn't funny. We'd watch it and I would just pray the guys were alive. And then they would get up and they were absolutely fine. And then we would watch the playback on video and then we were relaxed enough to laugh." End quote. The big joke on set was that Home Alone was almost turning out like a kid's version of Straw Dogs. The production designers worked hard to ensure each trap would look painful, but also seem like something that was engineered by a second grader. Even the battle plan that's shown on the film was drawn by the head production designer, John Muto. Being right-handed, he drew with his left hand to make it much more unrefined. They shot more pickups of the traps and surrounding regions before finally finishing the shoot on May 16th. The sets were dismantled in the gym, but the editing bay was now crowded with John Hughes, Chris Columbus, and editor Rajna Gosnell, who went to work at putting together the movie that John had written. They almost had everything to complete this puzzle, but they still had one thing missing that's vital to any movie: music. Early in the production, they initially hired Bruce Broughton, another composer whose work is sadly underappreciated. His background in movies and TV is extensive, but most people remember him for scoring several Disney attractions, including Spaceship Earth, The Universe of Energy, and Soarin' Over the World. Chris wanted to work with Bruce since he had already scored Young Sherlock Holmes, a movie previously written by Chris. Though he was hired and even given initial credit on an early poster for Home Alone, another movie he already signed up for was going over schedule, Disney's The Rescuers Down Under. He had to fulfill that commitment and had to bow out of Home Alone. Chris sat around with the production team asking for other suggestions for composers, and someone brought up John Williams. They laughed for a bit until an awkward silence came about, to which Chris Columbus then asked, "Why not try to get John Williams?" Chris then made a call out to Steven Spielberg, who he wrote Gremlins for, who then got him into contact with John. They explained that they had a low-budget family Christmas movie that needed a sentimental sound. Something that would be Christmas, but also nostalgic. Something that a child might hear in a church and groan that it was the 100th time that they heard it. They then sent him a rough cut of Home Alone, and he absolutely loved what he saw. He was able to work as he wasn't scheduled for Hook for a few more months. Chris couldn't believe it. John wanted to do the movie. John wasted no time and used the rough cut as a key. The rough cut wouldn't be too much different from the final cut, so all he had to do was put in the right music. To create a timeless feel, he drew upon Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker, staking its claim as the most nostalgic of Christmas musical pieces. There are videos that go into more detail on the music of Home Alone's connection to The Nutcracker, and why it has a nostalgic feel. But what I'll add is that John Williams both wanted to make a musical theme that had Christmas-inspired instruments like bells and glockenspiels, and wanted to use his music to help tell the story. Like when you see the scenes involving the Wet Bandits, the score becomes dark and mysterious. Or when you wake up with Kevin on Christmas morning, you hear a soft but rising sound of Christmas joy. As soon as editor Rajna Gosnell put together the music and the movie in another rough cut, they got another screening with John Hughes, Chris Columbus, and the Fox executives, and they were in awe. I can't stress enough on what a musical genius John Williams is. His score took what was supposed to be a simple family holiday movie into something bigger, something more important. They saw Home Alone as a beautiful movie with a score that transported them into a Christmas world of enchantment. Everyone was confident that Home Alone wouldn't have a problem making back its budget. Now, the question was, would audiences see the same thing? They held a small premiere in Chicago on November 10th and was released widely on November 16th, opening against Rocky V and The Rescuers Down Under. Rocky V was the more anticipated movie, especially since it was in more theaters, and The Rescuers Down Under was expected to take in most of the family crowd. But something unexpected happened. Not just families, but everyone was going to Home Alone. It became the #1 movie at the box office, and then again the next week, and the week after, and the week after again, and so on and so forth. Fox was amazed at the return results. In a typical box office run, a movie loses its gross percentage by about 20 to 30%. Home Alone kept a consistent pace for several weeks where there was almost no drop-off. They expected to continue making money as the Christmas season was starting soon with the kids getting out of school, but again, everyone wanted to see this movie that was getting great buzz. They even took advantage of that when they pushed their marketing with more TV spots.
Home Alone is bringing down the house.
Excellent! I love this movie. Terrific.
Hands up!
Yes! I loved it!
Is there a movie better than Home Alone?
I don't think so.
There's no place like Home Alone. Rated PG.
Now playing at a theater near you.
The movie would remain #1 all the way through February of 1991. Even then, the movie kept a hold on family audiences, not dropping off the top 10 list until the end of February. Home Alone would finally exit movie theaters in the last week of June. Yes, a Christmas movie was able to remain in theaters over half a year. Keep in mind that in the days before streaming, movies had a much larger window in theaters, sometimes staying for months if they were popular. In fact, sometimes they might even get a second release if the studio is looking to milk as much profit as possible. In my episode on the Santa Claus, I talked about how that movie opened when a re-release of The Lion King was going on. Home Alone would end up being John Hughes' biggest hit, grossing over $470 million worldwide. This would put it up as the third highest grossing movie ever, and yes, I do mean as in the biggest movie hits of all time, not adjusted for inflation. It was just behind E.T. and the original Star Wars. This was all, of course, before movies were capable of making more than $1 billion. It would, however, remain the highest grossing Christmas movie all the way until 2018 with the Illumination animated adaptation of Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Home Alone would also end up as one of the biggest hits on home video, selling over 11 million VHS tapes and Laserdiscs. It would also be a success on DVD, Blu-ray, and even digital streaming, usually being in the top 5 most bought or rented through iTunes, even as recent as 2020. So, why was it a monster hit? Why do people keep coming back to it every holiday? Like a lot of things, I think it's an accidental combination of several things. Children love stories of kids being empowered. Adults are fascinated by the perspective of kids and how they don't need parents to solve all their problems. But is the story enough to carry it? A little, but the actors also help. I can't think of other people who could have done better than Macaulay Culkin, Joe Pesci, Daniel Stern, Catherine O'Hara, John Hurd, or even Robert Blossom. They give off just the right balance of heartfelt, intimidating, and funny reactions. It never felt forced or phoned in. But even then, is that enough to justify success? Well, I have another theory. I think a lot of the success has to do with the overall look of the movie. Director Chris Columbus wanted every scene to feel like Christmas as possible, even in scenes that didn't call for it. The effect of consistently seeing warm variations of red and green, along with a lighting style that showcases a lot of glow, seems to give you a perspective of the holidays that one might see as an adolescent. That creates a nostalgic lens that's very dreamlike, not too different from our own memories of Christmas. Oh, and a nostalgic sounding score probably helps too. John Williams would end up nominated twice at the Academy Awards for Home Alone, one for original score and another for the song Somewhere in My Memory. John Hughes set out to show that we as people never stop growing up. Not as teens, not as adults, and in the case of Home Alone, children grow up sooner or later. I myself originally saw a fun story about a boy who has to fend for himself. As an adult, I see this as a Christmas memory experience, even more so than a Christmas story. Not only does it take me back to 1990 when I saw my first movie in theaters, it returns me to a place where children have a little more power than the rest of the year. Kevin McAllister brought his family closer when they saw that no one should be forgotten or left behind. He saw that without his family, Christmas felt emptier and even fake. You can put up a tree, have a macaroni and cheese dinner, and leave out milk and cookies, but it means nothing if there wasn't anyone to share it with. Somewhere in my memory, Home Alone has become a glorious Christmas reflection of the past.
Thank you for joining us on this sleigh ride into the magical world of Christmas movies. Check us out for weekly rides into your favorite Christmas classics and their histories. Be sure to give us a positive review on iTunes if you like what you heard. And don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook and Instagram for updates and special news. Consider subscribing on Patreon in order to help keep the show going and to gain access to some special gifts not available to the public. Merry Monday to all, and to all a good night. See you next week.
Cut. Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.